Hello, everyone. Great to see you all popping in. I'm just going to, as we do normally, for those of you who are frequent joiners to these events, we're just going to give it a few minutes before we formally start. And yeah, just make sure everything's in order there. Great to see so many familiar faces popping up. Hello, everyone. Yeah, so sorry, I'm just letting people in from the waiting room now. There's a queue of names popping up, so that's why I'm weirdly staring at the camera and talking gibberish. Dave, do you want to say something interesting while I have to fill the dead space?
You're doing a great job there, Luke.
Yeah, so yeah, there's still people popping up. We give it about 30 seconds to a minute before names stop popping up, and then we'll start.
Perfect.
I don't know. I know a few people on here will be great to see you too, Bob. I know people on here will have maybe done the ones the last few nights since the Celtic Whisky Fest started with my colleagues Al and the lads from the Celtic Whisky shops. If you have, I hope you've enjoyed them. I know, sheer from the volume of these packs that went out, that there'll be a lot of people here who this is the first time doing a whisky tasting as part of this Celtic Whisky Fest or Celtic Whisky Festival. Just for those of you who might not know, we were obviously doing this series of 2 tasting weeks, 2 weeks of tastings to fill the kind of the void left by Whisky Live, which is now moved to March because of COVID. A date that we thought, a time in the future that we thought would be totally untouchable and safe, and then now with the case numbers and everything, you're kind of thinking, oh my god, is that even safe anymore? But this is a night for forgetting all of that stuff and enjoying this. It's kind of gone quiet in the chat there, so we might start now. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Luke Crowley-Holland. I'm the manager down at the Celtic Whisky Bar and Irish Whisky Experience down in Killarney, the world's largest collection of Irish whisky. We have a huge collection of Redbreast running going back to the 1970s, some of the bottlings. So for those Redbreast lovers, it's worth getting in there. We've also, after launching Drams Delivered, which allows you to buy samples of some of our collection and have them posted out to you. So if any of you haven't gotten on that, it's worth getting on the Celtic Whisky Bar website and having a look at that. There's some really interesting and old rare whiskies and stuff that you know you won't find in a regular bar, let alone be able to buy a sample of. I know a few different places have been doing that since COVID started, so we only launched ours there 2 weeks ago. So it started off well so far. This is probably one of the best tasting offerings we've had, both in terms of the caliber of someone like Dave coming on, a blender himself, rather than a brand ambassador. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but also the deconstructions, for those of you who've done a lot of our tastings since we started them last year, have been fantastic. We did a Bushmills deconstruction, which was phenomenal. We did with your colleague Derek Power a few months back. We did a John's Lane deconstruction, Dave, and it was fantastic. So before we get started, do you want to tell us a bit about yourself and about what order we're going to be tasting in tonight?
Yeah. So thanks for that intro, Luke. So hi, everyone. My name is Dave McCabe, and I'm a blender at Middleton Distillery. So we'll be responsible for the likes of Redbreast 27. So in terms of the lineup, what we look at maybe in order, I was thinking we might look at the bourbon cask sample first, then the sherry, and then the port, if that works for everyone else.
Yeah, that sounds good. And what was I going to say? You were going to tell us a bit about the history of Redbreast itself, so as well, to start with.
Yeah. So I suppose before we get into the samples, I won't keep you too long before we have a glass in our hand. But you're probably, most of you would be familiar with Redbreast and the name, particularly. It's been around such a long time. It wasn't always made in Middleton, and it wasn't always made by Irish distillers, which I think is a very interesting fact. But what we do today in the making of it, we try and pay, I suppose, homage to the tradition of how it was originally made. So historically, in the 1800s. It began its life in Dublin, where it was produced pretty much by a wine merchant. And what this wine merchant was, he was working in Dublin. He was W&A Gilbey's was the name of the merchants, and they were buying wine in from abroad, from Spain, France, Italy, Portugal. And back then, when you bought in barrels, when you brought in wine, you brought it in its barrel. So you were selling the wine from the cask itself. And when the cask was empty, it was normal tradition for these wine merchants to actually bring these empty barrels to a distillery and have it filled with new make spirit just produced from the pot stills. So in the case of W&A Gilbey, they were sending the casks to the Jameson distillery in Dublin to be filled, brought back to the wine merchant, and they would then age it themselves, sell the whiskey as their own, and they would call out on the label perhaps where they had where they'd sourced the whiskey. So, Castle Grand was the old term or the old label for Redbreast originally, but in 1912 it got the name Redbreast. And there's a few stories as to how that name came about. I suppose the most well-known one, whether it's true or not, but the most well-known one was to do with the chairman at the time, who was a Gilbey family member, and he was a big bird watcher, big ornithologist. And the story goes he wanted to name 3 whiskies that they produce after 3 birds. So he wanted to call one after the Redbreast, the Robin Redbreast, one after the Yellowhammer, and one after the Chaffinch. But you can only imagine being a fly on the wall in a meeting like that, and everyone's eyes rolling the back of their heads going, how do we just keep this guy happy? And they maybe just gave him the choice if you can name one after one of the birds. And that's where the Redbreast got its name. But there's other stories as to where that might have come from. Speaking with people, particularly in work, like the likes of Carol Quinn and other people, you often hear that people were drinking whiskey at a time in history where people might necessarily be able to read and write. In Ireland, particularly in the 1800s, easily 1900s, and they would be calling out a whiskey on the shelf in a bar, and they might say, just give me the one with the red crest or the red breast. And that's sometimes where a name might evolve from as well. So for me, equally interesting. Which one of them you want to believe is entirely up to you, because we don't have any facts on that. But I think they're good stories nonetheless. So the idea of a merchant selling whiskey that they would have bought from a distillery pretty much was phased out as distilleries started bottling in-house and selling the whiskey under their own names. So that fashion died out, and that fashion also died out with Gilbey's. So the last few bottlings probably from them would have been in the 1980s, and say early 1990s, there was no Redbreast produced. So Middleton Distillery kind of took it up again as a style, started producing it, and it's been around ever since again, thankfully, because for me, it's one of my personal favorites, especially as a blender. You're very close to it, so it's a treat every time we get asked to make it, and even a bigger treat every time we get asked to talk about it with people and drink it. So I'll get into a bit about blending and things, but maybe if you want to pick up a glass and have a nose, and I suggest picking up the bourbon sample. So this is pot still whiskey, which was laid down, as we say, or distilled and put into cask the 22nd of May, 1990. Interestingly enough, when we fill a barrel with spirit, it's usually at about 63 to 64% alcohol. So if there's any American guests on, if you just double that, that's the proof. So 126 proof, give or take. And this has reduced right down to 48.3% or 96 proof. And that happens naturally over time. The alcohol strength reduces over time in Ireland and climates such as Ireland. And also the volume in the barrel reduces over time. So we have a kind of a rule of thumb where we say 2N plus 3. So for every year something is aged, multiply that year by the number 2 and add on a 3. And that's probably the volume you've lost in the barrel from all those years of aging. So what this barrel is, we call this a second fill barrel, meaning it was bought in from the States after it was seasoned or held bourbon. We used it to age whiskey, and when we emptied out that whiskey and bottled it, we used this particular barrel again, and that's why it's called a second fill. So you might see the color isn't, from all the years of being in the barrel, the color isn't extremely dark. It's not really amber gold. It's more on the gold to light side. And that's because being a second fill barrel, it's not giving as much oak contribution as it would had it been a new barrel. So if you want to give this a nose and see what you think. When I nose this, I think of, from a fruit point of view, I think there's a mixture between the sweetness and the fruit. And I think of candied kind of apple with a touch of orange peel, so to speak, kind of a light orange zest. But also, and I was looking at this just before the call, joining you, Luke, and I was just going through myself, and what jumped out at me as well is like a ginger, freshly grated ginger kind of spice character, as well as a little touch of coconut, kind of shavings, dried coconut as well.
Mm-hmm. It doesn't have that big green apple kind of orchard fruit punch that you expect from a bourbon cask. Which
exactly.
It's a bit different in that sense.
That's exactly right. You know, when we use a freshly arrived in bourbon barrel, you know, there's still an element of bourbon in the wood, and when we fill our spirit into it, you know, as you said, you get more of that bourbon seasoning influence. But on a second and sometimes on a third fill, the bourbon influence is pretty much diminished, while the previous Irish whiskey in it is enhanced, if you know what I mean, and then the wood is peeled back. But have a taste of this, see what you think.
And anyone listening, for those of you new to join us, I know, excuse me, a lot of you have been on before, but we want to get your tasting notes and your questions in throughout. So don't be shy. David, in my experience, after the second whiskey, they'll all start chatting away. They just need that bit of lubricant on their fingers. Paul too, he says, you said it was put down in May 1990. When was it disgorged?
So this is actually still in barrel. So this hasn't left the site yet. What I'm showing you here is the last whiskey we're going to have is Redbreast 27. And what I'm showing you here are the parcels of casks in the warehouse that we draw from when we make Redbreast 27. So the first three whiskies we're going to look at are samples of whiskies from barrels, which normally when the next bottling requirement for Redbreast 27 comes, we'll pick from these parcels, marry them in the formulation that makes Redbreast 27, and that'll go. So what you're drinking now hasn't actually left the site. It's still aging as we speak.
Mm-hmm. I had a few questions myself about that how you come up with the formula for Redbreast 27. We might hold that off for a second, because just while we're on the bourbon, obviously, you know, bourbon is famous, or especially second fill bourbons, for allowing the spirit to come through. You obviously, correct me if I'm wrong, you make 3 different styles of spirit in pot still down in Middleton. Which is used in the Redbreast, and what are the reasons behind that?
Good question. So you know, when an Irish Distillers was formed, which was in the 60s, it was an amalgamation of 3 existing distilleries at the time. So you had the Jameson Distillery, you had the Powers Distillery, which were both established and running in Dublin, and then you had the Cork Distilleries Company in Cork, where we're still based. So you can imagine at a time where 3 companies, and kind of family owned, you know, to a degree, had to come together and acknowledge that the whiskey industry was in a crisis, and that, you know, if they kept, you know, being separated from each other, that, you know, they could be extinguished, and the flame of Irish whiskey could be put out. So it must have been a very tough decision for them to come together in the first place. So you can imagine that it would have been harder again to decide, okay, well, whose spirit style are we now making now that we're one entity? And I believe that's kind of where the idea of us still today making 3 distillate types stems from. So to give you an idea, you know, we use the same ingredients for all the pot still whiskies that we make. So we use a combination of 2 types of barley which has been malted, which means it's been harvested, soaked in water, left to grow, and then it's dried. And when you drink a single malt, that's whiskey made from 100% malted barley. If you were to have a sample of barley malted in your hand now, you could crush it in your finger and be very sweet, kind of biscuity, malty. Think of, we would say Ovaltine or a sweet cereal character. So when we use that, we actually combine it with barley, which hasn't been through the malting process. So if you had that in your hand, it'd be like trying to break open a stone. It's extremely tough. But what we find is when we use it in combination with the malted barley, and we brew it and distill it, we find from a texture point of view, it carries a bit more of a kind of a silky mouth coating texture and a bit of a spice. So when we make when we use those barley types, malted and unmalted, and we turn into a beer, we'll distill 3 times in our pot stills. But how we distill in the pot stills will result in the final spirit having its own particular flavor. So we actually make 3 styles based on how we use the pot stills. So for example, one variable would be that you change the distillation running times of each pot, which will result in the final spirit having a particular flavor. If you change that, you'll change the next batch and so on and so forth. The elements of the spirit that you don't use in the final spirit, or the elements that you collect during distillation, which we call the heads and the tails, they're not particularly great on their own if you're to make a whiskey from them, but you do recycle them. So you do add them to the next batch and so on and so forth. And the amount of that you add to every other distillation will change the final spirit as well. So they're all, ways of how a distiller would describe it if they were here to say how they play different tunes on the pots. So the 3 we make, we categorize them in terms of light, medium, and heavy. And that's not to say that the light is the watered down version of the heavy or anything like that. It's just from a texture point of view. But the light we would find carries more of maybe a spicy element to a degree as well. So it depends on how you want to configure what light means. But for us, it doesn't mean that it's lighter than the heavy side from every angle. It's just lighter from maybe the oily character. So we make a light, medium, and what we call a heavy or a traditional style. So for the likes of Redbreast, 12, Lustow, the 15, we would use 2 types of distillates, and that once they've aged in their respective barrels, we would then marry them. So we use the light and the medium. But what we do for the Redbreast 21 and the 27, we actually use all 3 styles. They're always left to age separately, and once they've come to the right age in the right barrels, we then marry them. I don't want to use the term blend because sometimes you might get confused with a blended whiskey, and this isn't a blend, but you're still mixing barrels to make your final product. So what we're lined up with, the first 3, I'm actually showing you all 3 different distillates tonight as well.
Oh, wow.
So this one is what we call the light pot element. So if you're familiar with Powers, Luke, you were saying you did a John's Lane.
We did a John's Lane Deconstruction, yeah, with Derek. And I was actually surprised to hear that was the light, because like you were saying about the light doesn't necessarily mean light, because Powers to me has always been the spicier, of the kind of the main blends that you do, and to hear that that's coming from the light is really interesting.
And to kind of showcase the spirit even more for John's Lane, you're using more of these refill barrels rather than the first fills, which give you more oak and maybe bring down some of that distillate character, or kind of, impinge on it a bit more than a second fill barrel would have. So this, it would never be this old for John's Lane, clearly. So by moving the age, you can move the flavor spectrum to fit another brand. But when you drink John's Lane, the distillate you just drank there is the same distillate as John's Lane, but at 12 years of age, if that makes sense.
Not to keep it with Redbreast, but not to go but to jump a bit away from that. With say something like the Redbreast 10, which has really unique notes, it very much tastes like an older pot still style, having been fortunate enough to try some of them both from Bow Street or from the 80s or 70s in Middleton. What is that the traditional pot, or is there, how do you manage that?
We manage that in a way that we normally set aside the traditional distillate because we make so little of it. We normally set that aside and let it age quite old, and it would be used for what we consider our real ultra premiums like 27, Redbreast 21. We use a small amount in Middleton, very rare. And they're the kind of three main brands. Barry Crockett Legacy would be another one. So we really keep it back and we keep it old a lot of the time. But what's interesting is when we get to do one-off limited editions and expressions and we want to make something that's unusual, we'll actually use it at a younger age. And that's what we use in the Redbreast 10. And we upped the sherry element with it as well. So the idea was we use what we normally reserve for the old, because it's a bit heavier, it's a bit, more pungent, a bit more oily. And then we use it at a 10-year age. And that's why you're finding it kind of showcasing that it's a bit older than its years, you could say, as a style. So that's the Redbreast 10. But I think what's important for Redbreast 27 and the other brands as well, or other Redbreasts we make, is that we always talk about the sherry as a main key driver in flavor, and it is, but the majority of the barrels in a blend or in a mix is usually the bourbon cask. So the most numerous barrels in the mix is actually bourbon, but it's the sherry and the port in this instance that you will find when you look at them now really deliver the icing on the cake in terms of the first impressions when you taste the whiskey. But in the final Redbreast 27, when you taste them, you get any bit of a candied apple, as I said, kind of a ginger spice, orange peel. For me, I would attribute that to the bourbon that we're using here, the bourbon barrel whiskey. So I hope that all makes sense, Luke.
No, that's great. We've got some great comments coming in from the chat. Reinhard says, please sell this on its own. Strong peach notes, love it. There's actually a 1995 Middleton single cask that the Celtic Whisky Shop does. It's first fill bourbon, but it's 20 odd years old, and it's if you like this style of whiskey, it's definitely worth having a look at. Cormac's a tiny bit of sediment in his, but +1 on the peach notes. Michael also agrees with the peach notes there. M. Weiss says, should we be adding a touch of water to this or leave it as it is? Water very, very much changes with a drop of water. What would your call on that? Yeah,
it's definitely, water is definitely a preference for a lot of people, especially higher strength whiskies. But for me, I don't know if I'd add it straight away. What I like to do is try it neat, add a bit of water afterwards, just to see what does the water do to it from an aroma point of view, as well as taste point of view. So like for me, it's very, personal preference how much water you would add. Like I would always add a little drop of water after I've tried it, maybe once or twice neat, and then I'll add a bit of water and let it sit as well, because when you go back to it and compare it to the next few samples, you'll see that it does change. I really like the idea of the peach being mentioned, because tropical fruits is something we always attribute kind of some of these styles of whiskies to as well. So that's a great shout out there.
Derry has a question here, which I suppose ties into which Cormac has answered actually, but we were talking off air, not to sound like we're on anything but a Zoom call. But the before about the use of Irish oak. I don't, no point getting too down that really interesting rabbit hole. But there is a new Dargaelic out or coming out. I believe, David, is there?
So we literally today just launched the latest edition of our Middleton Dargaelic series, which is single pots of whiskey, which we would have aged in bourbon casks. And then its final, say, year to 2 years is where it's aged in barrels made from Irish oak. And what we've done with all the latest, or all the editions we've released, is we've worked with landowners, forest managers, and we've procured trees, literally trees where we would have picked some of the best trees in an area that are looking to be felled in the sense of forestry management in the first place. We work with a guy called Paddy Purser, who's a kind of a consultant in forestry management side of things. So this year we actually collaborated with an estate, David Walsh Chemist in Ballykilcavan. He's a land there called Kyle Beg, or Cuil Beag, which is the Irish for Kyle Beg. It means small wood. And we felled trees there back in 2015, and those trees went as trunks to Spain, and they were then quarter sawn into staves, made into barrels after they were left dry for 15 months. They came back to us We then fill them with whiskey between 15 and 25 years for another 15 months. And today was the official launch, where we're releasing 7 whiskies, which each whiskey can be traced back to one of 7 trees that was used to make the barrels for the whiskey. I'm not sure when they're all going on sale. I think it's staggered in terms of what tree numbers are going on sale, but the official launch was today in Port I'm actually sitting in a hotel room this evening with you after the launch earlier on today. So it's a good release. The whiskey is fantastic. There's a great story with David Walsh Chemists and the amount of work they've done in building up what was a plantation to now a pretty mature forest. So much so that's actually reintroduced wildlife such as pine martens and red squirrels since he started that kind of, I suppose, challenge on improving the land in the area. So great day, great whiskies, and no doubt you'll see a lot of Facebook and other media showcasing the bottles and the packs as well.
And this edition called Cuil Beag, or
yeah, it's going to be called Milton Dargaelic Kyle Beg, and then there'll be Cuil Beag in brackets somewhere on the label or on the packaging, just to showcase the Irish name. But the Kyle Beg series from the Ballykilcavan estate in Portlaoise.
No, very good. Not Cullen Foley says the Kilkenny trees are usually the best, which is interesting comments coming from a Washford man, but there you go. Tom asks, what acronyms are used for the 3 pot still types that we just discussed?
So the acronyms are for the light pot, we call it LPM, and we call it LPM-1. It's just our own internal codes. The next whiskey we're going to try is the heavier one, and we just call that MMP4. So that's an old code that has been with us ever since. And then the final whiskey is the middle style, which is MMP, and that's before we go on to Redbreast 27. So we might move on.
So yeah, we might move on to the sherry cask. Yeah, I was just going to suggest the same thing. Perfect.
So this is an interesting one now, Luke, as well, because the way we use sherry barrels, we actually we fill them in different ways. So what we will do is we will, as they come in just in a certain time of year, usually kind of winter to spring. We'll fill them with a few different things. So we segment them as they come in, and we fill some of them with new spirit, and we leave them age their entire lives. What we'll do with others is we'll actually take whiskey which has already aged in other barrels and then move it into the sherry and then leave it age. And then the final one, where something like Redbreast Listowel is, where we'll take aged whiskies even older and just finish it in sherry for maybe a year or 2 years and then bottle the whiskey. And why I'm telling you that is because this sherry whiskey sample we have now, the whiskey in the barrel hasn't always been aging in sherry. It actually started life out in bourbon, and then we moved it into sherry, and it's been continuing to age ever since in that. So the whiskey itself was laid down the 31st of October, 1985. So it was left in there. And what we did was in 2012, when our batch of casks came in from Spain, we filled some with new make. We filled some with, say, 5-year-old bourbon aged whiskey, some with, say, 15, 20-year-old. And we also filled some from this 1985 parcel of bourbon casks in 2012. And that's what you have in front of you. So you can see the color is quite rich. If you have in front of you, the strength is a bit higher than the previous one. It's 51.2% alcohol by volume. And the reason we do that partial aging, or what we call a recasking, is sometimes you want to create diversity in what the sherry casks can contribute. So if you want we'll age whiskies for the full length of time in sherry, and you get extremely rich dark berry fruits, raisins, and a good kind of element of tannin. But if you put whiskey that's already been in bourbon, you're bringing whiskey into the sherry that carries an element of sweetness, like caramel, toffee. You mentioned kind of apple, that kind of character to it, and it then evolves with the sherry impacting on it. And that's what we kind of want for the likes of Redbreast 21 and Redbreast 27, because we use such a small amount of barrels in the making. We don't want to use one fully matured sherry that would take over the show in terms of personality and wouldn't give the other barrels as much of an individual say, rather than the way we do it in this sample, if that makes sense.
I think so. Peter said they didn't understand the percentage there. I'm not sure if that means in terms of alcohol by volume or whichever, but
well, maybe I'm not clear with when I say the barrels come in and a certain percentage goes into each barrel. What I'm saying is, for example, we'll get in maybe 6,000 to 7,000 sherry barrels in a year, and we'll say, okay, a certain percentage of those barrels will fill with new make spirit, and a certain percentage will fill with already mature whiskey, and leave that whiskey continue then to mature in the sherry, if that
as a finish,
sense.
Yeah.
So we have different kind of, I suppose, there's some of the barrels are predestined as to what they're going to be filled when they arrive. So the first, say, 1,500, 2,000 barrels, we might say, okay, new make light pot spirit into 100 of them, new make mod pot, or the heavy traditional pot, into 500 of them, and the medium into the rest. And then the next tranche of casks that arrive in from Spain will say, okay, I'll empty out 100 bourbon barrels, and what comes out of them goes into 60, 75 sherry barrels, and then continues to age. But if you want to give this guy a nose and see what you think. So for me, you can see how different it is to the bourbon barrel. And one of the first things that jumps into my head is a touch of like licorice, think of, those licorice, all sorts type of character coming through. But you will get this kind of vanilla sweetness. There's a little bit of a raisin character, I think, of like Californian raisins when you're young, and as part of your daily diet in school. But there is a little kind of element of a mentholy type of herb note as well, which I quite like.
Yeah, Richard and Sandy there said caramel and dark dried fruits. It's definitely kind of the caramel, or like a sticky toffee, and then there's dried fruits then as well. Yeah,
syrupy element to it, and even blackcurrants, or like a lemon kind of cassis, on the palate then.
Wow, the finish is just like it just doesn't stop, like it's just hanging there.
Yeah, for me, there's an element of like a dryness to it, a bit more tannin. Originally, it's like, even as I'm talking now, there's a bit of a mouth puckering sensation, kind of like a full-bodied red wine, if you know what I mean. There's that kind of tannin at the start. But the more I'm talking, there's a bit more of a kind of mouth-watering sensation developing over time. But very rich, treacle-like, you could say syrupy, some people say like molasses type of, that's a bit, say, exaggerated, but the idea is there that there is a viscosity to it, I suppose, is what I'm trying to kind of say. But the finish is very rich. Again, at 51%, if I asked you to guess that, for me, I wouldn't have thought it's that high.
No, definitely not.
I would have said 46, a 46 offering, kind of thing. So it just shows that it's very, very mild in that intensity, despite the higher alcohol percentage. But definitely a good long finish there as well.
No, definitely. Not Cullen Foley says that could be a single cask on its own. I think definitely, I agree.
Yeah.
There's some great comments there in terms of. Sorry, yeah, go on.
No, I was just going to say, for anyone who has a bit of the first sample left, if you go back and when I talk about fruits, apple, candied sweetness. Again, people mention peach, apricot. Just the difference is, it's very striking. It's from one distillery, but how you make the spirit, how you age it, and what you age it in, you have two extremely different whiskies on your hands there.
Well, the contrast actually, there's more of a kind of like a candied, boiled sweet kind of flavor, a lot more tropical flavors now. Having tasted the first one again there, just took a sip of it, compared to, in contrast, it's like when you're tasting heavily peated whiskies and taste a light peated one, you barely notice the smoke. Whereas when you taste the light peated one in a range of non-peated whiskies, suddenly that one seems really intense. And there's definitely that contrast here where it definitely brings out a lot more, and going back to visit the first one again.
from a blending point of view, you've hit the nail on the head when you're trying to figure out intensity in a sample by lining them up and comparing them. You know, only when you have whiskies in a line do you actually really see their true potential. And I used to find this, like, I started in Irish Distillers 2010, and you know, when I was out with my friends then, you know, and I'm telling them everything I learned that day in the distillery and stuff, I would end up buying like a bourbon, I'd buy a Scotch, and I'd buy an Irish, and I'd pass them around. This was obviously, you know, a long time before COVID was ever around. We could do these things and just show them, like, when you have whiskies lined up together from different world, you know, distilleries from different parts of the world, it's only when you have them side by side you really truly get what a bourbon is versus an Irish versus a Scotch, and vice versa. So always compare and contrast is important, I think.
Mm-hmm. There's some fantastic comments on the caramel flavor and the sherry finish. On that end of the sherry cask, the way the finish almost dries out, the more longer it goes in the sense of literally not you know, in the sense of dry in the absence of sweetness, like. But with it does taste like a good. I had a bottle of sherry Oloroso in this room somewhere from an old tasting. It does taste like a good 30-year-old sherry. Like it really, you know, I know it's a sherry cask. It's an obvious thing to state, but a lot of sherry whiskies you don't have that the DNA of the sherry isn't as present in there as you would expect it to be, you know.
Yeah. What I'm finding the aftertaste is like, think of like almost like a nutty character, like almond, and even like toasted almond. So there's a bit of a burnt but nutty aftertaste to it, and that would be a very striking feature in a lot of Olorosos. So speaking of sherry, you know, this cask, what it is, it's a cask that was made in Jerez, which is one of the regions within the sherry wine region in the southwest of Spain. And the casks would have been made after, you know, the wood is cut, it's left to air dry naturally for about 18 months. And when the cask is made, it's then seasoned with sherry wine for 2 years, and it's Oloroso sherry. So it's a semi-dry kind of style of wine, with a lot of nutty, kind of almost like a little dark chocolate, bitter chocolate kind of characteristic to it, with a kind of a good level of astringency to it as well. So that's what comes over to us, and then we fill it. So Oloroso will be the main type of wine seasoning that we get done.
Is it European oak or Quercus alba?
It's European, which is a bit ironic or contrasting in the world of sherry, because a sherry producer will
uses American oak. Yeah.
Use American oak, and that stems from the wine merchants' days. When I talk about Gilbey's and, you know, importing barrels from Spain, the Spaniards knew that they didn't want to be giving away their American oak sherry casks. So what they were doing is they were making barrels from local Spanish oak as shipping barrels. So
transportation casks.
Transportation. So they were, you know, aging their wine in the Solera system, which is like a layered aging process, and they would use American oak for those barrels. But the shipping barrels to go over to the likes of a merchant in Ireland or the UK, that was made from local Spanish wood. So that's what we continue today, is we ask them to use European oak, which is a species called Quercus robur. So all our Spanish barrels are European oak, the way it was back in the day.
Mm-hmm. No, that's fantastic bit of information there. Because not a lot of people, you know, appreciate that the Solera system uses American oak, because it's more, after it's been used, it's more neutral in flavor than what you'd get. But Reinhard has a question there about your forecasting for stocks. He says, how do you know what you might need in 10, 15, 29 years down the road?
It's an extremely good question, and I wish I had a definitive answer. But to give you an idea of how we plan it is, we would plan out our forecasting out for the next 40 years. So how we do it is we would obviously work with the markets for the next, say, 5 years worth of expected sales forecasts for brands. So to give an idea of Redbreast 12, you know, all the markets would report back to our finance team, and they would say, you know, we predict based on current trends, Redbreast in France is going to go up by a certain percent. Redbreast in the States is going to go up by this percent. So from that, we'll get an idea of the future demand for the likes of Redbreast. And we try and work it out as far as something like, well, we actually go out, 40 years. So we'll say 2061, 2062, we need to plot a kind of an idea of sales forecasts. And it's kind of crystal ball stuff after 5-6 years, but you need to put a figure in there because we need to plan how much do we need to distill now for all our brands. So what we're going to distill this year will satisfy Jameson in 4 years' time. Some of that will satisfy the demands of Redbreast 12 in 12 years' time, Redbreast 15 in 15 years' time, etc. So you have to try and get it right now, because when the demand is there in 15 years' time, if you didn't put it down in barrels this year, it won't be there for you. So when you have to predict that, you have to predict how many sherry barrels you need, and they take 4 years to arrive from the day you order them. So we're still getting in sherry barrels at the minute. So we would have ordered them in 2017. The wood was sourced and dried for 1.5 years. They were then filled once they were made for 2 years, and they're only arriving now. So we had to rely on the forecasts from 4 years ago as to what amount of sherry barrels we need to fill this year based on future projections. So there's a lot of work in that, and it's really buoyant based on, like the economies in different areas, how brands will fare, things like COVID. So you have to try and work with the best information you have, and you have to lay down the right stock in the right barrels for the future. So basically, we have to make sure that at 26 years of age, we need to make sure we have enough barrels at 26 years of age to make Redbreast 27 next year. And we have to make sure we have the right amount of barrels now at 25 years of age to make Redbreast 27 in 2 years' time. And you have to go right back, that we have to make sure we're filling the right amount of barrels now, that when I'm long gone, or who knows, someone will have those barrels to work with for Redbreast 27 in 27 years' time. So it's a minefield, in terms of trying to get your head around that sometimes. But at the same time, the only way I can make Redbreast 27 today is because someone thought of that, not for a 27-year-old brand, but someone thought of putting down more than what's needed back in the day so we can use it today. So it's all about kind of a relay race to make sure the last generation looks after you and you look after the next generation, essentially. So there's a lot of my daily work is involved in that side of it.
Mm-hmm. We did a fantastic episode of the Celtic Whiskey Pod. It was actually our inaugural episode. It was with your colleague Kevin O'Gorman. And he actually, maybe not even as much detail as you just went into there, but he did a very good outline of that 40-year plan and how you plan out, because it must have been with the growth that Jameson alone as a brand, let alone Irish whiskey, has experienced over the last, let's say, 15 years. It must be no one could have predicted that, I imagine, when you were laying down casks in 1998 or whatever,
Yeah, even go back as far as 2011 or 2010, for Redbreast, we were only producing Redbreast 12. And then in 2011, we brought out Redbreast 12 cask strength. And then followed on from that was the 15, which became a permanent SKU after it was a one-off the first time it came out. Excuse me. And then we did Lustow and 21. So, that's only 11 years ago. There was only one Redbreast edition, and we have a family now, or a flock, as people say, of Redbreast. So it's how do you predict that? So you can only work with the information you have, but always put down a bit more than you need. That's my advice to any new distillery. Whatever you think you to make, put down more, and just leave it and forget about it. So speaking of more,
it sounds like a good segue. Yeah.
So this third whiskey then is whiskey which we've aged in a port barrel. We refer to them as port pipes, which is an old term to describe the type of barrel in terms of its shape and size. Again, it's a similar story. I don't want to bog you down with the recasking elements of all of this, but the whiskey itself is from November 1994. So this one actually just turned 27. So 3rd of November 1994, and it was originally filled into bourbon barrels. But in 2000, we then moved the whiskey into the port barrels, and we've left them ever since. So when we do the next batch of Redbreast 27, this cask type is eligible in terms of its age, spirit type, to be used in the next offering of Redbreast 27. And this is the medium style. So the sherry one was that traditional heavy style. This is the middle ground one. So on the nose, if you want to have a nose and see what you think.
Well, the color is stunning anyway.
Yeah, the color is very rich as well. For me, what jumps out at me is a little bit of a kind of a juicy fruit element. So I was thinking more like plums or stone fruit was the first kind of initial hit I got. But the more I nose it, I'm getting, what I can only describe as like an antique kind of wood furniture type of note. Some people might refer to that as kind of an old characteristic, but there's maybe an element of leather in there as well. Or a lot of people might say like tobacco, like a tobacco leaf type of character, but it's a mixture of that with a fruit element. But for me, I'm thinking stone fruits. I'm thinking of maybe kind of a ripe, juicy plum.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's quite perfumed as well.
Mm-hmm. You can often get with other port cask whiskies, you get a lot of sort of strawberries and raspberry kind of flavors, but they're not as present. It's very much, you say, leather, tobacco.
Yeah.
It's
and this is 57.1%. So this is the highest of the three here. So on the taste.
Wow. It just doesn't taste that high in the ABV either.
Yeah, there is that spicy intensity at the very start, but as you breathe and you talk, while the fruit element was there, and I talk about fruit kind of plum characteristic in the taste, there's a bit more of a textured fruit element. And I have, just as you mentioned, like kind of a jammy red berries, I actually have here like a mixed berry, I said, fruit compote, and I'm getting that in the taste, but I definitely wasn't getting that in the initial nose for myself. But I'm getting also from a taste point of view, like more of a stewed or a cooked fruit element as well. So there's like I won't say burnt fruit, but fruit that is kind of being toasted, like cooked, that kind of character.
Mm-hmm.
But also roasted kind of coffee bean effect as well, like as if you had a nice strong espresso after a meal, or after
definitely.
dessert, I suppose would be a better way to describe the sensation that I'm getting anyway.
Mm-hmm. No, they're fantastic. We've got a few comments in the chat in terms of tasting notes. So Bob says raspberry licorice. M White says lovely spicy start and moves to fruit. Richard and Sandy are very articulate by saying wow, heavenly. Not Colin Foley says this isn't too far away from the Method of Madness 28-year-old, which obviously a port pipe finish. So that's a good shout.
I think that's an excellent observation, because that Method of Madness port pipe is from the parcel of port casks that we do use in the making of Redbreast 27. So this is the next parcel on from that, but spot on. Absolutely. Well,
that's well observed. I was lucky enough to actually be drinking that last night.
I'll go away.
Yeah, that's a whole other story. So I know you've answered this, but I've forgotten it. So Paul Tui asks, what's the alcohol content of the port pipe again? It was the highest ABV. What was the exact volume?
57.1%.
Perfect. Now, I had a question there about, was it controversial within Irish distillers to use port? Because obviously I believe the Dream cask, that's a port cask finish thing, is a 28-year-old. Was that not the first Redbreast to not be a sherry cask? Was it in any way controversial moving away from the sherry heritage, or?
It's a very good question, because we had a lot of conversation about it here. Myself and Billy Lighton is the head blender, and he's my boss. And when we were toying with the idea of using port for something like Redbreast, there was discussions, and we're very, I suppose, mindful of who drinks Redbreast, and who drinks Middleton. We're not too worried with Method of Madness, because the idea is it's a new brand to let us experiment and not do something that might offend someone who's a true and loyal Method of Madness drinker. So, but when it comes to Redbreast, there is a following. There's a kind of a loyal, enthusiasm out there, and you have to be very careful when you do something new with a brand like that that's been around literally since the 1912 as a Redbreast name. And the last thing you want to do is do something that just doesn't fit the brand. But given that Redbreast is defined when we talk about it and when we market it, we always talk about the sherry influence and a Spanish influence. So it's a fortified wine-esque whiskey, and the idea of introducing something like port isn't crazy for something like Redbreast. So we didn't think it was something that might be not in sync with the brand and how people perceive the whiskey or the brand itself. Given it's from the same kind of Iberian area. It's the oak is the same, European oak. The seasoning is a little bit different. It's a bit longer, with the ruby port. But what it brings to the table from a flavor point of view is a bit more of a juicy, as I was saying, stone fruits, plum type of character, whereas the sherries bring that more dried fruit element like raisins, sultanas. So we thought they would just complement each other. That it's just broadening the spectrum of flavors on the same line. So your dried fruits is over here, your fleshy kind of plum fruits over here. So you're just expanding the line of the fruit that you can talk about in flavor.
So what you're saying is there's no difference between the Portuguese and the Spanish. Is that what you're saying?
There's big difference. But they very well cohabit, or coexist, I suppose is the best way. They complement each other.
They do. No, they definitely do. I mean, you don't have a huge history with port cask release to my mind. I mean, you have the Redbreast one, the Dream cask. I know the Middleton 26-year-old was a port finish, but there's not a huge array across all the brands of port influence.
No, but as well, what's interesting there is while there isn't, we've always been buying port casks. So like to have something now this age, this was filled into the port in 2000. So we've been constantly buying port, even though there mightn't have necessarily been a home to use it from a brand point of view until now. So it's always been good to just experiment, buy things, keep on buying them. And when the timing is right, there you go, you have it, and you can make something that's on a continuous basis from that.
No, that's fantastic.
So that's the three, as we say, deconstructed. They're the three, I suppose, most exemplary demonstrations of what goes into the making of Redbreast 27. So the last one is Redbreast 27. So this is a cask strength. I just brought a bottle sampled with me, so I don't actually have the strength on it. But the latest one, I'm not sure if you have in front of you, Luke, but it'll be in probably the 50s, mid 50s.
I don't have the ABV. No, not in front of me anyway. No.
Yeah, but it's up there anyway. It'll be about the mid 50s. I'd say 54, 55%. Just as a word of warning for anyone who doesn't have it or doesn't know the strength. So, when we use these elements combined, the port element will make up nearly a quarter of this actual formulation. The sherry will make up about 10 to 12%, and the rest will be from the bourbon. So have a nose, see what you think. And again, straight away for me in terms of nose, I'm getting the kind of the candied fruit, the ginger spice straight away, but there's this fast approaching darker fruit element with that little hint of leather to it as well.
It's hard to resist, not just knocking it back.
Yeah, very caramelized fruit element for me there. Touch of cinnamon, toffee coming through. Think of we talk about brown sugar, like Demerara sugar. or sweet like sugar cane kind of. And on the taste, what I really like about it is there's a fighting dynamic between the whiskey that wants to be dry and tannic, but it's being hit with a sweetness as well at the same time. So it's starting to be dry, it's getting sweet, a little bit dry and then sweet again. It's kind of there's a rolling conflict there, which I find very very interesting from a texture point of view.
Yeah, the first time I ever tasted this, I thought the port was really present, but having done this breakdown so far, I get a lot more of the bourbon and sherry coming through personally. I don't know if people in the tasting at home agree. Reinhardt says can clearly recognize the fruity bourbon element in the final product, especially at the beginning. Definitely. Cormac says I have a bottle of the 27-year-old and haven't dared open it. This is my first chance to taste. Dan has a question there about the breakdown in components in this. Now, obviously, with the 12, it's a marriage of sherry and bourbon, as is the 15, but the 21 is a finish. How did the final? I know we spoke a lot about the different aging and different components, but how does the final marriage break down in this in terms of how much of fully matured this and finish that and pure bourbon, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, first of all, the Redbreast 21 isn't a finish. It's not like we marry all the whiskies and then rebarrel it for the last few months of aging. It's all the barrels are added at the time of, say, vatting or bottling, same as the 12 and the 15. So here, like the sherry element will always be that heavier trad pot sherry. We'll never use, and I'm not saying never forever, but we haven't yet used, say, a sherry cask in the making of Redbreast 21 or Redbreast 27, where the whiskey has aged for the full 21 or 27 years in sherry. We've always began the aging in bourbon for the first 10, 15 years and then moved it into sherry for the final 10 or 15 years. And the reason we do it is, again, we don't want an extremely sherry-driven whiskey for these two particular styles. And by doing the recasking movement, you achieve that. An analogy I think that works best is like the last batch of Redbreast 27 we did was just 39 casks in total. So the idea is, that's a very small amount of barrels. So the smaller the amount of barrels you use, the bigger the influence in the final whiskey each of them have. So the analogy I'm trying to say is, imagine playing football, and if you're part of 10 other people, you'll make a contribution on the field, but you're one of 11. Whereas if you're playing 5 aside, there's only 5 of you, so your participation is a lot more influential in the game. So that's the same with whiskey. The more barrels you use, the more of an averaging out effect you'll get from the greater number of barrels. But the lesser the amount of barrels you use, the bigger the individual styles of those barrels are in the final product. So if we had used one fully matured sherry barrel or one fully matured port in this, I think for now anyway, the personality of that might take over the whole whiskey and it becomes maybe a bit more one-dimensional than you would like. I hope I haven't bored everyone to death.
No,
with
quite the
that
opposite.
type of construction with the whiskey, but that just adds to diversity of what you're doing.
Yeah. Cormac says no, keep it coming. Jade Lynch says so much fruit in there. That's superb. The complexity grows with every sip. Bob is my favorite comment of the night because he starts with I agree with Luke. He says the bourbon and sherry come through more than the port, and I agree that there is a rolling shift between the tannic and the sweet. A rolling shift is a very eloquent way of putting it. I like that. I also think that there's a heavy sherry comes through, even though it's only 10 to 12% of the makeup. Yeah. Leo says excellent analogy. He obviously fancies himself as being good at 5-a-side. Cormac says, "Oh, it's good. Getting lots of red fruits at the end." And yeah, so there's
brilliant.
No,
That's good.
it's I think well received all around. It's hard not to be for such a good whiskey. Is there anything coming? I mean, obviously we've had the Iberian release. We've got the PX cask, which is has sold out everywhere as far as I'm aware. I passed through Dublin Airport recently, and there was still a few bottles in there, but I'm reliably informed that they're all well and truly gone. What's next in that range, or can you share with
Yeah.
us?
Well, I can't say too much now, but the idea of the Iberian series is kind of what we discussed about the introduction of port, and whether that was a tough decision. And I think it paid off basically, and it still pays true to the idea of Redbreast being a fortified wine expression or influenced by that more or less. So the idea of the PX was something we thought, again, makes sense from a Redbreast perspective. And the fact that we're calling it a series, we're thinking we're going to try and take influence from that Iberian area.
So you're saying it's a port. You heard it here first. Is that?
But the idea is, it might be one every year. Like the PX was so well received, we're thinking, is that worth doing another batch at some stage down the line, and then move on to something else in terms of getting our hands on other kind of types of fortified wine casks, either Spain or Portugal, in those regions, and kind of trying to just keep on with expressions of Redbreast where we can showcase not only the influence of fortified wine of sherry, but other expressions or other barrel types in that area. So we're doing a lot of research at the moment in terms of what would be a good fit in terms of a seasoned cask influence. That would be the first element. B, we'll talk to our coopers and the guys in the bodegas to see is there something they have that we could work with, because some of the bodegas we work with don't just make Oloroso, they make other styles as well. So there's a few ideas in the hat, and we'll just see what works over time and watch this space.
Yeah, well, whatever you do, don't do an Anima Negra cask, because it will greatly upset Ali Alpine, who's on the call here.
Okay.
That's the niche he's carved for himself, so you can't.
I'll make a note here.
I've warned you now. Bob says I missed the ratio on the 21. Could you repeat? That was the one that I mistakenly called a finish. My understanding was it was 19 years ex-bourbon, and then moved into sherry casks to bring it up to the 21.
Well, the sherry percent, or the sherry casks used in the Redbreast 21 are kind of as you described, but then we add other barrels in with that. So we call it a vatting. So we'll take a certain amount of bourbon barrels, which have aged for 21 up to 33 years of age. First fill, some mostly second fill, even some third fill, and then we'll add in some sherry casks. But the sherry casks are whiskey that would have originally been in bourbon, then sherry, and then get included. So it's not a finish, so to speak.
No, yeah, that's marvelous, and it would be as Leo says in the chat there about the batch piece. Somebody's have to sure to be showcased. It'd be interesting to get a Paolo Cotardo or a Manzanilla. I was only drinking the Tobermory Manzanilla recently in this. Yeah, there is a whole family of sherries alone that could be explored there. So that definitely.
And I think Redbreast is a good fit for those, versus other, Powers seems to stand on its own 2 feet from a robust, spicy element. I think Redbreast might be a better fit for those. So we'll see how experiments go, and hopefully we'll have something to show you
And is there anything else planned? Yeah, is there anything else planned like the Redbreast 10, or is that?
We've been asked by marketing, is that something that we could do again? And because they were thinking it's a one-off, it's to celebrate an anniversary. We said fine, but the feedback has been extraordinary for it. So we'll have to revisit it. I'm not sure yet. It's just that the problem when you're a blender and you're asked to make a one-off, it's very easy to make an excellent whiskey, knowing it doesn't have to be repeated, because you can use the best of everything to make it. It's like if you're painting a picture and you say it's a one-off picture and you can use any color you want. But if you're asked to make another 10 years worth of it, you're down to just only a few colors, because it has to be reproducible every year. So you're limited to what you can use. So when you're asked to make something as a one-off, and then you're asked, could you actually make it again? We'll have to see, do the stocks are we able to do with the stocks that we have from the first time? So it's been talked about, but nothing has been mentioned more than just a what if.
Yeah, I drank 2 bottles of it. It's a phenomenal whiskey. So no, well, I mean, the questions have kind of slowed down, and I know I've thoroughly enjoyed myself and learned a lot. So I hope everyone at home has as well. We might give one more minute to ask everyone what their favorite of the 3 was, or did everyone prefer the 27, or was their favorite in the first 3 elements? So we might give it a minute for people to chime in there, and then we'll leave you get back to the hotel lobby or hotel bar or whatever there. Cormac says 2, 3 and 1, so that's the sherry, port, and then bourbon. Dara asks, how quickly can you get an idea from an idea to taste and experiment? Oh, sorry, how quickly can you go from an idea to taste the experiment, I presume he means?
It's a good question. We'll have the idea first, obviously. The next part is quality control. So, while we'll get samples of the seasoned liquid from a supplier or a bodega, we actually have to analytically check that from a quality point of view, just to see that there's no what are called phthalates or microplastics in it from if they held it in a plastic drum before filling into the barrels, etc. They're all kind of EU regulations and health regulations, obviously. So once it passes that test, as well as our own sensory distillate review on it to say, do we like it? Do we think it would work if it was in a barrel and we put whiskey in it? So from that concept, we'll then purchase a number of casks, fill them, and we'll trial it for probably about 6 months minimum, but we'll taste it every kind of 4 or 5 weeks as an ongoing. And then if we think it's working, we can kind of say, look, can we maybe look at getting more casks come in and fill it with the same liquid and build up our stock that way. So that's that'll be one avenue you go down.
Yeah. No, that's I mean, it all sounds very overwhelming, to be honest, but very interesting at the same time. So we've got a few in there. My friend Kevin O'Donoghue says port finish. Patrick goes with 3, 2, 1, which is the port finish as well. Roberts goes with sherry. Ellen goes with sherry. Branko goes with port. Trevor goes with sherry. Patrick goes bourbon, 27, port, then sherry. M. White goes sherry, port, then 27. We have the sherry again. Just giving a quick glance over the rest of them. So there's a lot there. I think the sherry maybe just edges it behind the port, but we might have to get the VAR in on that to double check that. Listen, we won't keep you any longer, David. I hope you've enjoyed it, and
it's been brilliant.
I hope everyone at home has enjoyed it, and thank you for coming is what I meant to say. But after 4 whiskeys, you start to lose your hosting ability. But no, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. And if there's any questions we missed, or anyone who has a question they want, if you email it to the link you got the Zoom link from, we'll get it answered for you either. Someone else might be able to answer it, or we'll pass it on to David and he can answer. So thanks again, everyone. Enjoy your night, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.